Okay, this is Stu. We're going back in the day with Anne-Marie. How's it going, Anne-Marie?
Oh, really good. Thanks, Stu.
Excellent, excellent. All right, let's hook straight in. You are a native of
Adelaide.
Adelaide. Okay, so when did you leave Adelaide?
Well, I left there a few times. I left there originally in 72 after I'd done a couple of years of work. And, Adelaide was terribly boring. And there was quite a big downturn in the music scene. And I thought, I've got to get out of here. So I went to Sydney. And I was allowed to do that at sort of 19 because my auntie lived over there. And everyone figured, I wouldn't get into any trouble. My auntie would be there to bail me out.
I wonder if the history in the world aunties have ever actually fulfilled that role.
Well, she was sort of the matriarch of the family, so I'm sure she would have. But, I was a very...
You didn't need bailing out.
No, I suppose I shouldn't say that, but I was the model child.
Okay. Okay, so you just mentioned that the music scene went a bit sort of downhill in Adelaide, and that was sort of helped prompt you to leave. What was the first thing you saw that you can remember?
Well, the old music scene I wasn't part of because I was too young, but we're talking about Masters Apprentices, the Twilights, the Valentines with Bon. Sort of went way back.
Bon Scott, who played the flute in that band?
He could have. He was one of the two singers. There were two guys singers, which was quite unusual. But my ex had been to see all these people. In those days, the guys were really allowed to do things at the same age. But it was all right for the guys to be out, but not the girls.
So was it a pub type scenario, or was it like I know in Sydney in those sort of early 70s, late 60s, there was a lot of scout hall, rural hall type things going on where bands were playing a lot of the, Akadaka and all that. They played in a lot of the sort of Hurstville Police Boys Club and places. Yeah.
I know, it's hilarious. Well, I think that did go on, especially people like Mal Eastick with Stars, Mel talks about that at some of his shows here. They were in the garage for a long time. But these guys were already so huge that they were at what was a disco. We called it a disco, but it was really a 60s discotheque. It was very London, swinging Adelaide, and that's where it used to happen. And there were a couple of those, and they were kind of underground in town in Adelaide, and it was a very big deal.
Okay. So was this... I don't have my Adelaide or my South Australian history down perhaps as much as what it could be. But was this in the years of Don Dunstan, or was that before Don Dunstan?
Oh, yes.
Because he was a very progressive premier for
he was,
time.
But, not about hard rock, I don't think. That's why I think it sprang up, because it was completely anti-establishment to have all that great music. And it was mostly because of the what was a satellite town then, Elizabeth, which was about 20 k's north-east, I think, of Adelaide. And it was connected with a huge big highway, but no one ever went out there because you were afraid of getting beaten up. You had people like Barnsey and Swanee out there and all their cohorts. And, it was a bit scary going to Elizabeth if you went to a gig. So that's where all the great singers came out of there, Glenn Shorrock and all these guys. Okay. So they were just doing what they were used to doing in the UK, but we had no competition, just the local guys. So it was fantastic because they just started up band after band after band, and they were all always successful because they were so good.
Wow. Okay. Wow, I didn't know that.
Really good.
Excuse me. So You hightailed it out of Adelaide, went to Sydney. You drove?
My Tirana.
I'll bet that was an adventure.
My bright green Tirana. It was with my brother, with my youngest brother, but only like 13 months younger. He was real streetwise, compared to me. And we didn't even know that we were sort of music people, because that's just what you did. You had a radio in the car for the first time, and my first car was a Mini. I didn't even have a radio. So, you just lived with the top 40. That's how it was. And everything was in the top 40. It wasn't country. It wasn't, different genres. It was just all great music and trying to get to number one. So we hit Sydney, but I wasn't thinking music. I was actually going over to do a course, a fashion course at Randwick Tech.
Okay.
And so we, found a flat near Paddington, and it was quite near getting to Randwick on the bus, all that sort of stuff. But the music scene was big in Sydney at that time. What was happening, I can't even think. It was sort of pre-AC/DC. But we were mostly only listening to stuff on the radio anyway.
Yep.
And it was like early ZZ Top. And it's sort of Deep Purple had dropped away. The Beatles had broken up. All the big names were all not so great. But there was a bit of resurgence there with ZZ Top and LaGrange. And then after that followed a whole lot of other guys.
Okay.
Yeah. And then what happened in Australia, unfortunately, I think they put an import ban on the overseas music. So that was terrible. And you could only buy stuff from an import record shop.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
okay.
there used to be a good one in Pitt Street. And that went on for quite a while. And it's pretty well documented in the Countdown thing, the Countdown years. They talk about that. And, Australian music, I think mostly was happening out of Melbourne at that time.
Okay. I know in my years, sort of my formative years, when I first started getting into music, Pitt Street was kind of the place where all the alternative record and the import record stores were.
Yeah.
There was one called Zounds.
Yeah, Zounds.
And
that's the one I knew.
There was one further down towards Central Railway called Phantom Records.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and none of them are there anymore. Of course, I only recently, as I was explaining to you the other day, I've been able to determine what's popular and what's semi-popular by looking at things on YouTube and seeing how many views that it has.
Like, it's all changed.
Yeah,
It's not just what you go and do yourself on the weekend.
So there was a lot of buying singles back then, all the 7-inch singles on records. Perhaps not as much buying albums.
No.
I guess
I only ever bought singles, and my ex was the album man because he was in the Australian Record Club. And you had to pay, only had to pay $5 for an album.
Yeah, right.
And you'd order one a month or something or other.
Okay.
And when I first met him, he gave me Led Zeppelin 4. I was over the moon. It was just the most incredible gift I'd ever had.
Oh my God.
I played that poor thing to death.
So you came to Sydney, you started your TAFE course. There wasn't government there wasn't government payments for people back then when they were doing tertiary, so to speak, education.
No.
How did you survive? Did you get a part-time job or something like that?
Yeah. Sorry, this was all a night course. But I did meet some real rag trade people there.
Okay.
Yeah, the young kids who were sort of only 18 or so, first job, they all had to do that course as a kind of prerequisite for their job.
Yep.
So they all turned up. It was like 6 till 8, a couple of nights a week. So it was great to meet them because then I really got an idea of the real world and how it all worked. Instead of it just being something I wanted to do for myself,
So was there much culture shock coming from Adelaide to Sydney?
Oh, yeah. Well, in those days, everyone used to complain about how dirty Sydney was,
Okay.
And I guess they were only talking about the city. So that was pretty awful. But I was so excited I didn't really see that. Today, I would think it was hideous. But I just picked out all the old history sort of spots anyway. I used to hang at Mrs. Macquarie's chair and Blues Point and all those kinds of places, and the rocks.
Did you walk across the Harbour Bridge? Is that sort of?
Well, only because it used to shake too much. I couldn't handle it. I went weak at the knees, but I went up, into one of those towers, but not to the top.
Oh wow!
Yeah,
okay, I've never done that.
Yeah,
I've walked across the Harbour Bridge, but I haven't. I haven't been inside it.
I would have loved to have done it, but I just couldn't do it. I just had that vertigo thing going on, and I don't think you could get up the pylons then anyway. You could sort of walk up to them, but I think, and that was more of the Sydney grotty scene. It was all just. No one saw the value of any of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Certainly you never saw any tourists.
Look, I mean, you look at old photos of Sydney and it's basically completely devoid of any trees.
Oh, yeah.
Like, I mean, when I say old photos of Sydney, I'm talking back in the days before colour photography, the 40s, 50s.
Oh, yeah.
It's amazing how much greener. it is as a city now compared to
Yes.
how it used to be.
Yeah, it's gorgeous. I mean, I really compare even Grafton. You know, when I came up here at the end of '98, the main drags in Grafton were like Sydney used to be. Just this concrete jungle.
Yeah,
there was
right.
just nothing leafy whatsoever.
Yep.
And to go down there for the Jacaranda Festival was just, these terrible bitumen streets, and then
one or two streets have got the figs down each side, and that's basically it.
Yeah.
They're not the main street; they're sort of off.
No, I had to go looking for the Jacaranda streets. You know.
Yeah.
And I was a bit disappointed, but it's just fantastic to see that the councils have got on board with all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Because even Yamba was the same, and now Yamba's fabulous, you know.
Yeah. There's a lot
And,
although they've just stripped a lot of the greenery from downtown.
Oh, did they?
Yeah,
Whereabouts?
All along Coldstream Street, heaps of
No.
like a lot of trees are gone.
Oh dear. Well, that's
because they're the wrong trees.
Oh.
Like they got to put the right trees in now.
Well, I haven't been out for a while because I've been suffering with all this smoke haze. But when I leave here today, I'll go down and have a look because it's very dear to my heart what they have done in the time I've been in this area, and I just think it's fantastic. It's just come straight out of council, so they've got some good people in there.
Yeah. So, okay, you were going to Tech 3 2-3 nights a week, and then what were you doing during the day?
Oh, right. Well, plan B, secretary.
Okay.
The secretarial week. But it was great because I got a job downtown in Bligh Street, which is the real older part of town, obviously named after Captain
Bligh, yeah.
And I was working for a property developer, dare I say. But it was very groovy, and it was a lot happening, new buildings in Sydney, and they were great buildings. It was all happening there.
Yep.
And, the whole town was full of big cranes and stuff, and those terrible boards along the sidewalks, noise. And you went out at lunchtime, and all you could hear is drills and stuff. I just thought, what do I come to? But it didn't faze me because it just all seemed so fantastic and new. And so different to Adelaide.
Yep.
So I mean, Adelaide's come on now. It's it's always been claimed to be the state that didn't have the convicts. So it was quite aristocratic in its day, in the really early days. Some big money in Adelaide. And it was there was just nothing for younger people to do. All we had was a couple of radio stations vowing for the #1 spot.
And there was no Rundle Mall back then. It would have been Rundle Street.
Yeah, and that's when it was better because all the hoons in their V8s would go down Rundle Street.
Doing blockies.
Yeah. Thursday or mostly Friday and Saturday nights. And so we'd all be walking on the sidewalks going out to tea with our parents or something, and all these fabulous cars have been just crawling up and down Rundle Street.
So back in the late 60s, those cars would have been like 40s, 50s cars, wouldn't they? Like 20 years old type.
Not really. The big Moffat Falcons. All that. I mean, they were only about $4,000 new.
But $4,000 was a lot of money back
heaps.
then. Like my parents' house in Sydney in the western suburbs, I think only cost them like $11,000.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It was still big money. But there were plenty of guys that had those Falcons. You could see every colour.
Okay. I often think, like, when I look at Happy Days,
oh, yeah.
and you see it's set in the 1950s, and you see all these 1950s hot rods, it's like, I'm sure the kids would not have been rich enough to be buying new cars and making them into hot rods. That was the one continuity flaw with Happy Days. Is like all these kids were driving hotted up 1950s cars in the 1950s.
But I think it used to happen. I think that was my thought first too when I saw it. But not knowing much about America in those days, I do think it used to happen. They certainly did up cars.
I just thought they kind of did up cars that were like, if you were like a 17-year-old kid buying your first car, it's usually 20 years old. Like even now, you get a 17-year-old kid buys their first car, it's a late 90s sort of model because that's all they can afford. Then they do whatever they do to them. I just kind of assume that that's how it would have been back then. You know what I mean? Like younger people would have been buying older cars for less money and then turning them into hot rods or whatever.
Exactly. Well, I just assumed that, it was parents' money. And there was so much money after the war in America that I think a lot of it would have been not just doing them up themselves. Because I knew guys like that, in the 70s.
Okay.
And, I mean, it was such a struggle. You could only buy one thing a week, for the car.
Look, I guess there was a fair portion of those of young people that had Sandman panel vans when the Sandman came out. So, I guess when you're 18, 19, 20 and you've left school and you're working and you're living with your mum and dad, you've got nothing really else to spend your money on.
Yeah, that's right. Well, petrol was so cheap too, so you didn't have much outlay and it all went into the car. Much to the girlfriend's chagrin.
I used that word the other day.
Did
Yesterday, yeah. Basically the first time, I think. Okay, so you got to Sydney and you got yourself a flat in Paddo.
Yeah,
and
with my brother.
You started to hit the pubs, hit the bars and see the bands and things like that?
Well, actually, it didn't really. I can't. I think we were more interested in driving around in my fabulous Toronto, which was only a stockie, by the way, and just to all the sights. I mean, it was so vast, you know.
Yeah, okay.
You drive down to Cronulla, that's where you'd see the Sandmans at the beach, and I used to love going to the North Shore, right up to Palm Beach. This same auntie had a little shack up there, and they'd had that since the 50s when they used to actually be in Canberra, and they'd go up to Sydney for the weekend. And this little shack just happened to be at the bottom of Nat Young's new block and his fabulous house. They saw his new house go up.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so they got to be friends with Nat. And when I met Nat Young, when I came up here through another friend, I said to him, did you remember the two sort of oldies, as it were, groovy oldies that had the little shack at the bottom of his place? And he said, yeah, I do remember them. It was amazing.
I saw him the other day, actually.
Oh, did you?
Yeah. He always says hello to me. I've never been introduced to him.
Oh, right.
I spoke to him in the car park of the beach one day. He actually told me I got a good wave. I was like, oh, wow. and then I started chatting, and he told me about got in trouble off his wife for flooding the basement or whatever it was.
Crumbs. Yeah, no, I thought Nat was a great guy, and you know, we just knew about him so much through my auntie. It was a strange situation. And I had no idea that he was up here and had his own scene down there at Angari until this guy, Luca, who had surfed with him in the early 60s in Sydney, says, oh, come down, well, you know, meet Nat. And I thought, oh, my God. So at least I had a good story to tell him.
Yeah.
And he remembered, so that was good.
Yeah.
But they were the sort of people you would remember. They were pretty hip.
What's the word? Bohemian?
Yes, that is the word. That's exactly what it is. And how they survived in that little shed, I have no idea. But they were always doing it al fresco long before anyone else.
It wasn't even called al fresco.
No,
it was just
it wasn't.
Oh, where are we going to eat tonight?
We're out in the deck.
Outside.
It was like the size of a postage stamp deck, you know. Oh, it's so funny.
God. Oh, that's funny.
They were great days.
Yeah. So what was the first... Sorry, hang on. I asked you what
music was happening. Well, I really had no idea because we were only listening to the radio. And, of course, Lawsy was at his peak then.
Okay, and what station was he on then?
Well, I just asked that of Greg earlier, Mr. Greg. He seemed to think it was 2UE, but that does ring a bell. Yep. And then Malcolm T. Elliott, who was a Mad Thing, he came on after.
I can remember him.
Yeah, from 9 till 12, I think, weekdays. But it was great listening to Lawsy because I'd be waiting for the bus and you'd hear every business had Lawsy on. You know, you'd hear it coming out of their doorways. So I used to get to hear quite a bit of his show, depending on how late the bus was.
I guess he wasn't considered as much of a conservative commentator as he is now.
No, he was, really out there. And they loved it when he would tell people, I would cut them off and tell them, what he thought of them and all that sort of stuff. It was just, he was like a god, that voice.
I was flicking through the radio the other day and he was on and he was doing that.
Cutting
people off.
Oh, yeah, still doing it. I think there might have been a time. Yes. I think there could have been a time when he sort of toned that down a bit, but now he's probably thinking, what the hell,
I hadn't heard him for, a long time, and some of the stuff he was saying actually was surprisingly not as conservative as what perhaps he seemed 10 years ago or something like that.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm thinking too.
He just, seemed to have seemed a little less conservative than when I was forced to listen to him. I don't know, probably out at work when I was still living in Sydney.
Yeah, it was always going.
Or a place like that. He just, seemed a little bit less conservative, a little bit more pragmatic without necessarily having to directly give the impression that he was either right or left wing.
Yeah.
Like it was, he just on one hand with regards to some things he seemed quite progressive, and then he's still sort of on the other hand there was a few things that he said that was like, oh yeah, well that's still pretty old school.
Yes, you would expect that. That's right.
Yeah, no, good old Lawsy.
Yeah.
So what was the first record you bought?
Oh, gee, well, it would have been A Hard Day's Night.
A single?
No, the album.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Well, I didn't probably buy it. It was probably a Christmas
gift,
present
okay.
or something. That would have been, 65 or something.
Wow.
Yeah, grade 7 in Adelaide. We have a different school system, or we did. We had a bit different system over there then. So grade 7 was the last year of primary school. And I'm sure that would have been a Christmas present. And as far as buying one myself, isn't that terrible? It's like Rock Quiz. I can't think of what it would have been. But it would have been a single, and it was probably something like Painted Black.
Okay.
The Stones or Ruby Tuesday or something.
The first record I got was a Christmas present, and it was a single, and it was Sure Knows Something, Kiss.
Oh,
and my sister gave it to me.
Oh, wow.
But then the first one that I bought myself was Let's Dance, David Bowie.
Oh, yeah.
And I bought it from Kmart. It cost, I think, $9.99 or maybe $11.99.
Yeah.
And I got it home. I put it on the record player, and it skipped. From the very beginning. And I took it back, and they put it on the record player in Kmart, and it didn't skip.
Oh.
And I was just like,
how
typical
terrible.
of my life. But yeah, David Bowie stuck with me sort of pretty well ever since.
Would have been good.
But,
yeah, so I'm just thinking haircuts now, Stu. We were talking about that the other day. I just love that you came up with Feather and Tails, because I've never heard of that.
Haven't you? Okay.
And I was trying to explain to Phil earlier, Techie Phil, about that conversation. And it reminded me of Magda Zabansky. That was one of her
character that she, that she would have.
I don't even know what that was called.
Shazza and Dazza or something. I think they were.
That rings a bell. And of course the guy, he was some famous comedian, wasn't he? The skinny guy. With her,
I can't remember.
He used to have that terrible crop top thing and the high-waisted jeans.
Yes, and the moccasins. But I think the moccasins was a very Melbourne thing. For like a very, very, very Melbourne thing. Right. I never saw, like, in the late 80s when I first started going out, or mid 80s when I was going out and I was underage, there was a few what I would consider Sharpies around.
Right.
But they wore boots.
Yeah.
Like, now, the Sharpies that I know of from Melbourne, like from what I've seen since, wore platform shoes. In the early 70s.
Really?
Yeah, early to late 70s. But yeah, no, I saw these sort of Sharpie-looking characters, and they were all, they were in boots, like either like a pull-on boot or like an army boot, but not necessarily Doc Martens, because they weren't all that. There wasn't that many places where you could get Doc Martens back in sort of the mid 80s. That sort of compared to now, you can buy Doc Martens anywhere. Like, but yeah, and they were also expensive for shoes back then. Like they were over $100 for a pair of shoes, and like that was just unheard of to spend that much. Like my mother would not let me buy a pair, but I went to England and bought a pair for £20.
Oh. So you got your Doc Martens.
Yeah, I got my Doc Martens when I was like 16, 17. But and then I went to Melbourne when I was about 15, and there was all these kind of characters around Melbourne wearing like ladies' Fabergé jeans that were so tight, and moccasins, and then they had these sort of Sharpie haircuts. But I was visited my dad's friends that lived right out in the burbs in a place called Keysborough, I think, which was just extremely suburban. And yeah, there was all these guys there that was just like completely, it was just totally foreign. It was though they were from a different planet compared to the fashions of Sydney. It was amazing. Like, did you find that when you first came to Sydney, the fashions were much different to Adelaide? And you're like, wow, look at all these freaky people.
Yeah, we always knew as Adelaidites that Sydney was way ahead with the fashions. Even the big department stores were 6 months behind what was happening in Sydney.
Okay.
And so, and actually it worked in their favour because they would take all the leftover stuff, that Sydney didn't want anymore because they'd all moved on.
Yep.
And we all bought it and we all thought it was fantastic.
Okay.
But for visitors coming to Adelaide, they must have thought, oh my God, And someone even said to me, I went for an interview at a fashion place eventually, and I remember the receptionist saying to me, so what's Adelaide like? Oh, I've heard it's a big country town.
Well, that's
and
what I would have said too.
I was devastated because, I knew it was pretty daggy, but, it was a city.
Yeah. Look, I moved to Melbourne from Sydney in 1998, and Melbourne felt like a big country town to me.
Oh, really?
Back then, yeah.
Gee.
I was probably a little bit up my own arse. I'm from Sydney.
We don't have trams.
Yeah. And I found it extremely strange that you would get on the train at Flinders Street. First stop would be Richmond. Second stop would be South Yarra. And to get second stop out of Sydney, there's a level crossing where the cars, where the boom gates go up and down.
Oh,
it's just
yeah.
oh my God, there's no way you could have that in Sydney. It was just imagine the traffic.
Yeah.
Now, the traffic in Sydney is as though they do have level crossings, but they don't have them.
Yes,
It's just,
at every corner.
it's ridiculous.
Oh, crazy man. Yeah, I have family in Melbourne, and they're all mad fashion victims, and they love Melbourne because of that. They were always able to find different things and always had a label. I used to cut out all my labels, and this is one of my aunties, but she was very young, and she said to me one day, "Cutting out the label? That's the best part." I said, "Oh, not the things I buy."
Oh, you mean in the back of your neck, so it wouldn't sort of be scratchy?
Yeah, I would just take them out because, I was a sewer and it's just superfluous material. But, she would be buying interesting label stuff.
Yep.
Oh, no, that's the most important part.
Got the label out. Nobody will know that it's
It's this could become
Maryvale.
Maryvale, yeah. Well, that was the biggest thing I loved. I really came because of the fashion thing, and that's what took up my mind. And Maryvale was so big then.
Yeah,
and the inn shops.
One of my best friends worked there in the 90s. Mr. John and Maryvale.
Oh, fantastic!
There was a
Mr.
cafe
John.
downstairs, and it was just right on near the corner of Pitt and Park, maybe Pitt and Park Street.
Oh, gee.
It was next door to City Tats Club.
Oh, yeah.
Tattersalls Club, which I don't even know if it's still there, but no, Mr. John and Maryvale.
Oh, fantastic. That
Mr.
must
John
have been.
died recently, I think.
Oh,
the last
did
couple
he?
of years, yeah.
Oh, but, yeah, that would have probably been their second shop. That's after my time. But we were sort of up the other end of town, working and going.
Yep.
You'd go to Maryvale's every day in your lunch hour to see what was happening.
Yep.
Oh, and she was such a great story to have been just a milliner.
Yeah.
Came out here and found that we didn't. Well, the 50s women used to wear hats, but then hats went out.
Yeah, right.
So she just reinvented herself and this fabulous label, and of course the hubby, Mr. John. And the other really huge thing that was happening at that time too was the Mary Miko fabric lady. I forget her name, but that was out of town. She was set up on the north side. Isn't that terrible? I can't think of the name now. Something Bridge, where that other bridge was.
Oh, Northbridge?
Yeah, Northbridge.
Yeah, okay.
And you'd be going down that May Dragon right at the end where some other big street crossed it, and that was the end of that road, was her place. And it was this incredible building with, it looked so groovy. It was some groovy design that she had with her fabrics. So that was very big deal. Sydney fashion seemed to be influenced by international people.
Yep, okay.
And this is why they were building the Opera House too.
Yeah, right.
So it was all about not Aussie, we were all so daggy. It was all about Jorn Utzon, and as much trouble as he was in with the Opera House, at least he was Danish,
Yeah, okay.
And Mary Miko was Scandinavian, and Maryvale was Dutch, and it was all about what was happening over there.
European.
Mm.
Yeah. What was I going to say? I heard something to the effect of somebody made some comment about Gough Whitlam. It wasn't until Gough came in that the 60s really kicked in Australia. And I was like, what are you talking about? Golf came in the 70s. It's like, yeah, the 60s really
Yes.
did, like the 60s for the rest of the world didn't hit Australia until the 70s.
Yes, that's right. It's true. I was only thinking about that last night.
Yeah.
What are we going to talk about today on this podcast? And I thought that might be a good thing because in our little trips around Sydney, not in the car, we moved to Surrey Hills later. And it wasn't very good. It was still pretty daggy, but it was just starting to still be affordable for uni students and stuff like that. So we managed to find a terrace, and so we walk around all these incredible old streets and see what was going on. And we walk up to the Cross, of all places, not realising, it's a bit dangerous thing to do. But at that time, hair had been happening, and it was kind of a good mixture of crowd. It wasn't, I don't think the drugs were so bad, or if they were, it was in the back streets.
Yeah, it wasn't out in the open.
Yeah, it wasn't in your face,
And then I guess also back then, particularly with weed, nowadays if you smoke weed in a public place, somebody's going to smell it.
Yeah.
Whereas back then, you smoke weed in a public place, people wouldn't know what the smell was.
No.
Yeah,
I was completely naive.
Yeah.
I had no idea.
And even the police wouldn't have. Most of the cops would never have come in contact with this before in their lives, and never heard about it, smelled about it, smoked it, anything.
No.
So it's just completely foreign. I was another podcast I did with a guy called Bruce. He was talking about about how much different and how much they just weren't onto it.
No.
I mean, I experienced a similar thing in the 90s with the rave scene. There was a period of time there where there was this level of liberation because there was thousands of kids going to a warehouse, taking drugs all night, dancing to this music, and nobody had a clue that it was happening.
Mm-hmm.
And then, accidents happen, or somebody dies or something like that, and then all of a sudden it comes in the media, the cops get onto it, cops started, and I guess that's probably,
Absolutely. Well, I don't remember seeing many police on the beat either. Any of those walks up to the Cross, you never saw a copper.
Yeah, right.
You'd see a lot of paddy wagons,
Yep.
a lot of cruising paddy wagons. So they're obviously dragging people off the street, taking them away. But
And did they have paddy wagons in South Australia?
No, we didn't even have guns.
Right, so it was like English coppers.
Oh yeah.
And did they wear helmets or did they wear hats?
No, they had a peak cap.
Okay, so they didn't look like English coppers.
It was like an armed forces person,
Yep.
Except no weapons. And I would have been afraid for my life if I was a copper, coming across someone nasty, because anything could happen to you. It's a bit like watching Heartbeat now.
Yeah, okay.
Yep. Those guys in the North Riding Constabulary.
And did they walk around? Did the coppers were they on the beat in Adelaide? Or were they driving around in Adelaide?
No, I don't remember seeing them much in Adelaide either. There was really no crime. There'd only been the Beaumont children going missing. And so, that was very strange and one-off. And, the coppers would be in their cars, and they weren't unmarked in those days. And my mates who were all into going to the drags and, all the illegal stuff, that sort of came through my brother. The streetwise
so you'd
brother.
go off to like some deserted place outside of the town?
Well, it wasn't even deserted. It was the main highway to Elizabeth because it was a straight strip. All the way was like the Nullarbor train track, And, so eventually they'd turn up and everyone, big major panic, and everyone would disperse, in their fabulous hot Tirana, like the real Tiranas, the XU1s. And,
that first sort of Tirana. Yeah,
fabulous Tirana. So it was a very big deal, and but no one ever got arrested. They were just, okay, boys, this is it, it's over for the night sort of thing. But in Sydney, I always used to get a very bad feeling about the police scene. They had that old yard, which was on my bus route into town to work.
Oh, the Darlinghurst police station.
That is now the big...
it's a tech now.
Oh, is it?
TAFE, yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, there's some Sydney police scene down there as well, big, rebuilt.
Yeah. I think it was on Liverpool Street or Goulburn Street or something like that.
Yeah.
Now they've got there was like a patch of land across the road from where the original police centre was, and now that's all this gigantic massive police setup.
Yes.
The one that you always see on the news.
Yeah, that's right.
Coming out of it.
So when our bus used to cruise down that, from Crown Street, down that curly street, it might have been Wentworth Avenue or something.
Yep.
It was probably very nice in its day, but it was, real creepy and grubby, and this great big yard of police vehicles or confiscated cars probably as well, and just the cyclone fencing. And you'd often see a lot of police just standing around chewing the fat, and they'd have their guns and everything. And we used to freak out, It really felt like that was the culture shock for us.
Yeah, okay.
If nothing else, it was just the whole police thing. It just seemed to be this heavy feeling in the air, and of course Askin was in power, all that corruption.
He was extraordinarily
It was
corrupt,
awful.
wasn't he? Yeah.
So, that was a bad end of town. I had to go past there because that's where the bus went. And you'd be on one of those terrible old green and yellow double-deckers or something, hanging on for dear life because you couldn't get a seat.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because back in those days, you wouldn't have to... You jump on and then the guy would come round with the thing, with his little ticket generator
and the
thing
coins.
and a little coin thing on his waist, and you'd have to pay your conductor. There used to be jobs for everybody back then. All these different, they wonder why there's why so many people are not working. There's so many jobs that just don't exist now that used to exist. There's a lot of jobs now that exist that didn't exist then.
The high tech.
But I reckon across the board, there's as far as unskilled jobs go, there's far fewer nowadays than what there was back in those days.
Yeah.
You could get a job as a conductor or
anything.
Yeah. A garbage man. Now you need a special license to drive a special big truck. And,
a garbologist.
Yeah.
Yes, I didn't know anyone that never was able to get a job.
Okay.
In those days, it's just the way it was, and there wasn't a lot available in terms of getting better, getting somewhere in life. You never thought about a career job.
Yeah.
That the girls that I knew could go and work in the local deli, or they'd go nursing, which was more training sort of thing, or quite a few of my friends went to business college.
Okay.
Even though we had done a commercial course and learned all that stuff. But, they didn't learn because they didn't want to. They weren't interested. So their parents had to pay for them then to go to business college and learn it all again.
More often than not back in those days, women in particular stayed living with their parents until they got married.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that was still going on.
Yeah.
It was very strange to leave home. Without
so
good reason.
You kind of would have been like a bit of the exception. Wouldn't have been the normal sort of done thing to do.
Oh, no.
I think back to my days and everybody moved out. Everybody had flatmates. Everybody shared houses with
absolutely.
people they had stuff in common with, or often people they didn't have stuff in common with.
Depending on the rent.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it was. It was really, and I remember all the people at my work, my first job, were sort of freaking out for me, going off to Sydney and, driving your car. And so that's why the story about the auntie, who would be there if there was any trouble, that appeased them a bit, that there were relations there. But, gee, I don't know how many times I had to tell that story because, the looks these guys would give you was, they were really afraid. They couldn't believe I was just going to take off. To me, I'd had a big plan. I'd been planning it for 2 years.
Yeah, right. Okay. So you ended up moving. You ended up getting a job in the music industry.
Well, eventually I did. That was a long time later, Stu. The fashion thing, I was working for a couple of guys eventually in the fashion thing, but they were mad things. They were tearaways, and they'd both worked in women's manufacturing. Big stuff, like when the gabardine pants came in.
Yep.
The trousers with the cuffs and the flares. That was huge. I don't know if it was huge everywhere else, but in Sydney it was just unbelievable. And so these factories are churning out all this stuff, and both these guys were salesmen. And they'd done very well, so well that, their egos were like, well, we could be doing this ourselves and making a fortune.
Yep.
So they started up this little shop in Sussex Street that was near what used to be Paddy's Market. And they got a girl, me, to do the phone and everything and a few designs. And then we had to get someone else to actually do the patterns because I hadn't got that far with my course. And so she came from the rag trade. And she would come in after work, after her normal job would finish. And she worked for someone pretty groovy, someone well known, more of a sort of a 50s women's label. I think it was lingerie and stuff.
Okay.
So she was interested in coming to somewhere where they were doing a bit more groovy stuff. So that was good for her. And she lived at Randwick, so she was able to drop me off sometimes.
Awesome.
Yeah, it was great.
Convenient.
Then my brother would come and pick me up in the Torana. And so that went on for a while. But, you know, they went crazy. And the money they did make, they bought land at Caloundra when there was nothing there. And it was like only $2,000 or something for a block. And they were just thinking they were going to become these big property developers, I think. I never really did ask them. But, you know, they had a mad, mad life. And they'd send me over to across the road to the corner pub every day about 2 o'clock and to go and buy a bottle of Benin. And it was the most terrible stuff, white wine. And because Sydney was into wine then, they had wine bars and stuff.
Okay.
And we'd get on this bottle of Benin and then another one. And then they go off and party for the rest of the night, you know, driving around really pissed. Can I say that?
Yeah,
it was all before RBT.
Yeah,
you know.
yeah, okay.
And that was their life. And they lived over at Harbord, so they would be stuck in that morning. They were in that morning traffic. You know, they had the beautiful sea view, and they were living this high life, and spending all their profits. In the end, they couldn't pay the loan for the Caloundra land. You know, it was a few blocks they bought, so it all sort of started to go downhill, and it was tragic because what am I going to do now? They're going to go broke, you know. So sure enough, the liquidators came in and I just went back to the secretary scene and I didn't mind because it was a lot more money. Sydney people, even the women who got less than the guys by a lot, was 3 times as much as I was making in Adelaide.
Wow,
and that was
doing the same thing.
No, that was at a very good job that was almost semi-governmental, and I used to get paid for my shorthand speed and typing speed. So I actually got more than the other people, you know. Because by law they had to pay you if you had these good speeds.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, that all got added onto your wage. But you know, I could fill up the Tirana for $2, and you know, money was no object. Oh dear, and you know, madly designing and making my own clothes. So I wasn't spending a lot. And it was really the trip to Sydney that I had to save for, and tyres and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So, Rego.
So, like, what was your rent? Were you were sharing with your brother?
Yeah,
when you first
I was
moved?
sharing with my brother, and we had. It was about $32 for an upstairs of a townhouse in Surrey Hills.
Wow.
And that was about the top price at the time.
So about $16 each.
Yeah. And I was earning about $75, you know. So, but it was just, it was unbelievable. So with the really good days, and I did manage to save because I thought, well, I will do something better after this. But I ended up leaving Sydney with my ex, actually. And my parents had gone to Perth they were supposed to be doing a round Australia trip with the caravan and everything and the dog and the rifle. But something happened. They got to Perth and Dad got offered a fantastic job that he just couldn't refuse. And they wouldn't let him keep the caravan on site. So he had to get rid of the van and, you know, my mum was bored and it all sort of started to fall apart. So I wasn't doing very well with the Sydney Air, which I hadn't even realised that, you know, would be no good for me. So my ex decided he'd go back to Adelaide for a while and I went to Perth to sort of sort out the oldies. And that was great because, you know, I just thought, wow, this is really just a smaller version of Sydney. They got the river, like a sort of a big river, like a harbour. It was clean, it was gorgeous, and I was just really taken by Perth. And that was long before it really took off. You know, Bondi was still there, all that kind of thing, and it was still a very, very small place in terms of what they'd done with their roads. They had made a terrific kind of freeway into town way back in about 1963. When we were first there, but that's another story. And so you could see that Perth really had vision, you know, and whatever's going to happen there was going to be really good. And the beautiful park up the top, Kings Park, all the real good infrastructure was there. So I decided to stay there for a while and I got a job at the University of Western Australia. And that just opened up a whole other world. And that's where I met Bon Scott's mother.
Oh.
She was our tea lady.
Oh, my God.
Yes. It's my real, claim to fame story about Perth. But it was amazing because I'd been there for a while, a few months. And because it was the uni, it was all very well set up. They had a huge, beautiful room up the top of one of their buildings that was our tea room. And we had a couple of faculty. So we'd all go up there for morning tea. And there was this lovely lady there, and she would manage the whole thing. It was all in teapots, the tea, and just all fabulous things came on trolleys. You got served. It was,
served by Bon Scott's mother.
Yeah, incredible. And then one day, because I was in charge of taking her supply requirements, she would come and see me, or I would go and see her. And it was just Mrs. Scott. Never ever dawned on me that,
wow,
who she might actually be. And so I went up there one day to get this list, and very heavy Scottish accent, a beautiful looking woman, You could see where Bon got a lot of his good looks. And I don't even know how we got talking about music, but I must have been waiting for her. Maybe she was on the phone or something. I had to hang around. She got off, and something came up about music, and she said, oh, my son's in a band, And I said, oh, really? And, it would have been good to go and see them. I'm just thinking someone in Perth. And she said, you probably haven't heard of them. And I said, oh, I might have. And she said, well, they've called themselves AC/DC. And I just, yes, I've heard of them. They're fantastic, And she said, have you seen them then? I said, yes, I have actually, by chance. I'd just seen them in Adelaide when I was kind of coming over to Perth in a pub. And I said, oh, don't worry about that, Mrs. Scott. They're going to be huge.
Wow.
And she said, so this was like about 1974.
Okay.
And I didn't even realise, but the guys must have already had some platinum albums or something, because she said, oh, Bond sent me his albums, and I'm thinking, the record, She said, I'll bring them in if you like and have a look. So the next day she calls me up to her little scene there at the back of the tea room, and she brings out the great big record company, platinum and gold albums in the frames, Wow. And the look on my face, I must have been aghast. And I said, oh, my God, you've got these from the record company. And she said, oh, have I? I said, yes, that's what, they get when they've sold heaps of records. And she said, oh, he must be doing all right then. And I said, oh, yes. And I think it was even then that, Molly decided that he would have to have them on Countdown. He'd been avoiding it like the plague. But in the end, he just had to. And so then she started to realise that, this is really good.
They ended up becoming a fairly regular fixture on Countdown.
Oh, yes.
I've seen some amazing footage with Bond dressed up as a schoolgirl.
Oh, yeah, with the plaits that
yes. The plaits kind of they got wire in them, and they sort of stick up
Oh,
and then Molly's dressed up as the Queen.
Oh, that's right. Oh, my God. Typical Molly. Oh, yeah, it was amazing. And so, I never thought of her as Mrs. Scott anymore because, it's Bond's mum. And I had no idea about the rest of his family until, those Countdown shows started coming on. And not the early ones, but the later, looking back on the years, And they put a lot of information in those shows that I'd never heard before.
It was an amazing show. My mum and dad, we used to religiously watch it every Sunday night, and often on the Saturday night when they would replay the Sunday before.
Oh, really? Oh, we didn't get the replay.
Okay. Yeah. No, we would I'm guessing they probably didn't start doing that, but they eventually realised that, we can play a replay of last Sundays on Saturday.
Oh, absolutely.
And still have people watching it. And it was
huge.
I used to have a little tape recorder that I would sometimes a song would come on that I'd like, and I'd hit tape on the record. Everybody be quiet, and everyone would have to be quiet so I could tape the songs off Countdown.
Oh, that's beautiful. Oh, yeah. Well, I remember when Molly really did the same thing to Cold Chisel, many years later.
Yep.
And I thought, he's not going to revisit this situation again because, they're obviously going to be huge. And he just doesn't want a bar of it. And so I always thought that was a bit of a shame because it wasn't what the people were telling him. you know.
Yeah, okay.
Molly was just off on it doing his own thing.
Yeah, he was, wasn't he? He still kind of is.
Yes, he is now for sure.
Although we haven't seen Molly for a couple of years.
No, I think I last saw him on the news when he'd had his fall.
I saw him at when that Sam, the guy that played him in the miniseries about him, won the Gold Logie, and Molly just kind of,
I did see
hobbled up onto the stage.
Yeah.
And it was like, oh, geez, you are old. You are getting an old man now. Like it was.
And being a St Kilda
Makes me feel old.
Yes, it's like all the songs I play. Everyone's dead. But no, Molly was done so well. That was really great, and I loved that guy, Sam. What is it? Johnson or Johnston?
Samuel.
Yeah, I think he's a Johnson.
Yeah.
And I could watch that again.
He rode a unicycle around Australia
to
raise money for cancer.
Yeah, for his sister.
Yeah.
He's a funny guy.
Yeah.
But he did that so well. And I suppose he would have had a lot of time with Molly to, get things right. Because he really did.
I think he's a Melbourne boy. So, Molly's a Melbourne boy, so they probably...
Yeah. And I didn't know that Molly was an AFL supporter. He's always been a mad St Kilda fan. So sometimes I see him in the crowd. That would have been the last time I saw him. They would have flashed onto him.
Yep. Right,
hoping St Kilda was going to win.
I'd be surprised if he could even walk. Like, that couple of years ago when he won that thing, when Samuel Johnson won, assuming that his name is Samuel Johnson.
Yes.
He didn't look well. Like, he didn't look well, and I haven't really seen him since.
We'll have to Google it.
Find
Where
the
are you
latest
now,
image
Molly?
of him. So tell us about 2SM. You worked
Oh,
at
yeah.
2SM.
So I'd
obviously
gone
got
back
to Sydney.
I did. I got back to Sydney. And that was after, a lot of other junk. I went to New Zealand for a working holiday for a couple of years and Kiss toured New Zealand when I was there.
Oh, okay. So that would have been in 1981.
Yeah, because I was there from 80 to 82.
Yeah,
so
I wasn't allowed to go and see them.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and apparently there was like outrage at the cost of the tickets.
Oh, really?
They were $13 each.
Oh, isn't that beautiful? Oh, yeah, that's a shame. Well, when you talked about Sure Know Something, wasn't that the B-side of I Was Made for Loving You?
Yeah, I think it was the second single off Dynasty album.
Oh, was it? Yeah. Okay. Because my single, I've got that on the B-side of I Was Made for Loving You.
Oh, okay, okay.
And it turned out, I was living in Queenstown in New Zealand there, which is right at the bottom of the South Island, sort of. And they were only doing Auckland and Christchurch, I think, over there.
Yep.
And it turned out that one of the guys I'd worked for in Adelaide, when I did get into the music scene eventually, he was their tour manager. Oh. And so I got this note from Robbie Robertson, as they used to call him, not from the band, but just, an Adelaide management guy. And he said, I'm going to be in Christchurch with Kiss, why don't you come up for the concert? But by the time I got this note, there was no communication much.
Yeah, it wasn't
to
a text. It wasn't a text. It wasn't an email.
It was all
would have been
too
a
late.
letter. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so it was very sad because if he'd told me, earlier, I would have got on the bus to Christchurch, which was the only way to get there.
Okay.
And it would have been fantastic. You can imagine. Oh, crumbs. Never mind. It was pretty much fun because some mad girls, local girls, lived downstairs in this house where we were, and they were all Kiss maniacs, just like you think of the Kiss Army. Well, they were like that.
Yep.
And they were younger than me, but they were from that generation. And in fact, I think they went up to Auckland to see them because that was, a much more big deal.
Yep.
And one of the girls' dad was the mayor of Queenstown. So she was a wild thing, and she always used to get away with it because, the dad could squash it all.
Dad's got a get out of jail free card.
But they all took off up there, and they just had such a great time, and the sort of thing that would live with you forever.
Yep. So you came back to Australia?
Yeah, so then I only had 2 years there. So I came back because this same guy said to me, when you come back, if you ever come back, come and see me because there'll be a job, I thought, oh, wow, how fantastic. So that's...
And as far as you knew, the job was just a music industry job?
Yeah, it would just be doing whatever for Robbie.
Yeah, okay.
In fact, when I first started with them, it was only because I was a temp and I got sent to this crazy place. that was doing the Evel Knievel tour.
Ah, okay.
And they, it was going to be so huge that they needed help. They needed a shorthand typist. So that was me, and so I rocked up at this place, and it was fantastic. It was in North Adelaide, which was sort of becoming very groovy, and a beautiful big old house, amazing old place, and that's where Channel 9 was, and it was really the arty part of Adelaide, North Adelaide. So I started there. It was only supposed to be for a few weeks, until Evil went home. And, of course, it all blew up into that terrible fracas where he wouldn't go on, and all the towns that had been organised, with hay bales and all the things that you needed for his madness. For things setting on fire, and it was all set in place. All the newspapers, all the local newspapers, all through Queensland, New South Wales, whatever, it was all happening. Everything was ready. And then he pulled the pin. And it must have just been the most, terrible financial crisis.
Oh, I've seen some docos. He seems like a real jerk of a person.
Crumbs. I think he was just chicken in the finish because he'd done it all before.
Yeah.
But I didn't follow him, so
Did he ever land a jump? Where he didn't, end up like a rag doll across the stadium?
Well, I think he must have in America. I hadn't really followed him. That's not really my thing. But I knew who he was. And the Stars and Stripes gear or something, wasn't there? The helmet, crumbs. I'm a bit like this mad thing on the ad now that comes on with the, I think it's an old, is it a Valiant, the orange Valiant or something? And he's always blowing himself up.
Oh, the insurance ad, Captain no,
I can't think.
Captain Risky or something.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, they're hilarious, those ads.
Well, I think that's sort of based on Evil, towards the end. I love that. And, so, that turned out to be... They decided to keep me on, that's what it was. Because, having shorthand was this fabulous, valuable thing to have. And so I just got involved in all sorts of wonderful things. But unfortunately for me, the rock side of this place had all moved away. The Angels had gone to Sydney, Chisel had gone to Sydney. They were coming back for shows, but, it wasn't the same as it had been.
Yep.
So I was, Johnny come lately. It was all very sad. But anyway, it didn't matter. I thought, it has happened. You could feel that, there'd been things going on.
Yeah,
you could feel the vibes.
Well, I guess that would have been Don Dunstan time.
It was. Yeah. Donnie was not very well thought of really by the normal people, like my dad and stuff.
Yep.
They all thought it was all a bit of a joke, but he was up there and it was happening, and really he didn't get taken down until Yana did that interview with him many years later.
Oh, okay.
When he'd gone to Melbourne.
Yeah, right.
And he was doing something with the Chinese. And, one of Yana's most famous interviews where Donnie Dunstan pulled the pin,
I'll have to
got up and walked out.
Look at that on the internet.
Yeah, you'd love that. And Yana was at her most gorgeous, And they still show that bit of that thing, that clip from time to time when they're talking about journalism and how good it used to be. And, Yana was really top dog then.
So 2SM.
Oh, this is terrible. I'm going back and back. So 2SM was much later. So that was...
so did you come back to Sydney and then find that job, or did you go to Sydney because you got offered that job?
No. What happened? Oh, I went to Sydney because I was... helping an Adelaide muso sort of depart Adelaide, and he was a bit too afraid to, make the move. But I could see that there was nothing. Adelaide goes.
So you were sort of acting as his auntie, like your auntie was.
Yes, I was the mother figure. Oh Christ! His mother was a Trekkie freak, and she was very strange, and she'd be up till 3 a.m. Every night, and I met her once. And she told this guy that I was too sophisticated to be involved with, which I would never think of myself.
Yeah.
Anyway,
that used to be funny.
So I said, well, look, I know Sydney, like inner Sydney, pretty well. That's where all your gigs would be. He was just like a solo artist, but he was looking to be in a proper band. He had his own little band, a 3-piece, but he was looking to be in a much better band. And so off we went. It was good. Adelaide goes through these lulls with their music. I don't know about now, but in those days it was either on or not, and at the time it was not. So we did that, and it worked out pretty good. I just went off temping, and that's where I ended up at 2SM, which is one of my jobs for a week or two. But it was great, and they ended up sort of having me come back quite a bit as people would go on holidays, like Ian Grace's girl, who just needed to be there all the time, could never get a holiday. Suddenly it was someone they could trust, to do it okay.
Cover her job.
Yeah, so she took a long time off, and then the manager's secretary went away, and it was really good. So I was more at the executive level, or up on the DJ's floor, which they had in that gorgeous little building at Blues Point there.
Yeah.
I don't know if they're still there.
I don't think they... Catholic Church own them, don't they?
Yeah.
2SM, yeah, okay.
Yeah, and that
was
was
this in the
great.
days when they had the round logo with the sort of
Yeah.
stick? Yeah.
I've still got that sticker. Rock of the 80s, 2SM. It was terrific. It was very cruisy, and there was no sort of pressure anywhere. The people that had jobs there had been there a long time.
Yep.
The lady that used to do all the prize giving stuff, she was an older lady with a family. And
I won Van Halen 1984 in 1984.
Really?
Off to
Fantastic.
SM, yeah.
Oh, you might have even met her. She was a mad thing, and she was gorgeous. We used to have lots of conversation, but it was
Baby smoking a cigarette on the cover.
I had the poster.
You can never do that now.
No. I was telling someone about that the other day. Yeah, I had the poster because the next temp thing I went to was Warner Brothers, which was kind of WEA.
Yep.
As well. It was only Warner Brothers Publishing, so it was the sheet music. So, one of the first guys that came in was Don Walker.
Oh, okay, from Cold Chisel.
So, I couldn't get away from Cold Chisel. It was heaven.
Or Text Charlie and Don for younger people.
So that was great, and it was only about 6 months, but just to see that other side of it, the sheet music and how it all worked, and the Kent Report, and sending off
the Kent Report used to be how you'd formulate the top 20, top 40, top 10
something like that.
Okay.
Everything was coming out of America, out of the LA office, so it was all very exciting, and I used to have to type up stuff that was happening for Barnsley, any of their what do you call it, if you've got your publishing with them, so we would pick out from all these reports what was happening for our artists, and sometimes they'd come in and then new stuff would come in and get played, and it was really great. And after that I went to 2SM, so that all sort of happened, and I was always hoping really to get into EMI, like a big place with really long-term jobs, stuff like that. And they had a very famous Studio 301 at the time.
Yep,
that was
I think it still exists.
Oh,
and
probably.
Still there,
but it was a very big deal at the time. And where I was living, there was a guy in one of the units. It was an old building, but one of the units there was a new guy that had come out from England, and he was working at 301.
Okay.
So it's funny, I thought, well, one of these days I'll just get there. All these little clues kept popping up.
Yeah, wow.
But, it didn't happen. And anyway, my health just let me down in the end, and I just had to go.
The air.
So that's what I did.
From the air?
Yeah, it's just too much pollution.
So did you enjoy many perks of the music industry when you were at 2SM?
Yeah, everything was free.
Brothers,
I went to 2SM was the fabulous Dragon reuniting thing. That was a big concert. Got to
when they came back after they'd been away for
got the house seat there, and there was always something on that you could be going to, and
there wasn't much in the way of festivals back then, was there? Like there is now. Everything's a festival now. It's like there's festivals all over the place.
Yeah, that's right. It was only concerts.
Yeah, although there was the Narara Festival.
Oh yeah. Well, I didn't even know where that was.
Yeah, but up near Old Sydney town. Yeah,
up north. There's always perks, it's part of the job. I don't know whether that still happens, but it's great. In fact, we went, the music publishing girls and I were sent an invitation to go to Studio 301's big party they had,
Okay.
So that was great. And I was always thinking, this will turn into something. This will turn into something good for me. But it wasn't to happen. And I just really, love looking back on those times. It was really good times. In a great environment. There weren't too many egotists. It was all just really great.
And you would have had a great view of the harbour, I'm guessing.
Oh, it was so beautiful. Well, the manager's office was, up the top, and that's where you could just look out. I had my back to it, unfortunately, but I used to get up a lot.
At least you could turn around.
Walk around.
Yeah, you could turn around and look.
Yeah, and you look down to Blues Point Tower and the bridge, and it was all gorgeous. They had the stuff on the windows. What is that? Like on my car.
Oh, like tinting sort of
thing.
things.
Yeah, it was a shame that the windows were tinted, so you didn't see the real beautiful blue. But then Sydney isn't blue anyway.
No.
Yeah, so
if that wasn't there, you probably would have ended up like getting burnt, like sunburnt, sitting at the desk at work.
The beautiful brown sky,
Yeah.
So, it's just as well there was grey tint on the window. I could just make out it was the windows. Nothing really bad happening outside. Yeah, so that was that. But Triple M took over from 2SM then, and their head DJ guy, Ian Grace, went to Triple M.
Okay.
So things really started to change because that was in Bondi Junction.
Yep.
So, the North Shore started to lose a lot of its pizzazz.
Yeah,
Everyone wanted to come back to the east side, and even some of the advertising companies did that. So there was East Sydney became a very big deal, and I was already living there, so it wasn't much of a big deal to me.
Yeah.
I'd much rather go over the bridge, but that's how things change.
It's like the years I lived in Sydney. The amount of times I went to. And I lived in similar areas to you, around the sort of eastern suburbs. Yeah, I probably could have counted on one hand over the course of 10 years how many times I crossed that harbour bridge and went to the north side. Like, it was just like, you just didn't do it. There was just no reason to.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it was only through when I was at Warner Brothers that was like, a bus into town, the train, get into Wynyard and catch a terrible rattly old train. To Chatswood, another bus up to Willoughby Road. And, I had to rely a lot on public transport.
Yep.
And even though in the end I did buy a car, I had no carport, garage, or anything like that.
Parking,
so it was a real luxury item.
Yep.
And I only bought it so I could take off out of town on the weekends, go up to the Blue Mountains or somewhere.
Until you eventually took off.
Yes, and then I really took off.
Relocated
all the way back to
Adelaide. New South Wales.
Yeah. Well, my dad passed away in 86, so that was a bit unexpected and terrible. So, a lot of things changed. I had to leave the temping and sell the house in Adelaide, get my mum back here. Things were never the same after that. But, it was a really great thing to have happen, and wonderful times that will probably never really be replicated.
Yeah.
Because it's such big business now.
Yeah.
We're more like America.
Yeah.
And we'll never get back to those real early days.
Yeah.
Where things were a lot simpler.
Yep.
And although it was still very hard work to get anywhere, you've only got to look at AC/DC and Chisel and stuff. It was such a hard road.
Yeah.
As Bond said, it's a long way to the top if you want to rock and roll, and it was. It was a long way.
And it's also a long way to the shop if you want a sausage roll.
That was so fantastic. I used to love what the crowds would do with the songs, like the Angel song.
Yeah.
It's fantastic because
Am I ever going to see your face again?
It means a lot to the bands, that
right.
the punters would bother to do that.
What was it that I was I saw an interview with the lead singer of the Smashing Pumpkins.
Oh, right.
And he was like, back in the day, they just wanted to play their whatever album they had out. You know what I mean? And it's like, we don't want to play the last album. We've got this album out.
Yes.
But now they're sort of, quite a lot of water's gone under the bridge, and rather than get the buzz from playing their latest music, they get the buzz from the crowd. And so they'll just play
what they want.
Yeah, they'll just play whatever they know the crowd wants.
Yeah.
And that's where they get that real sense of satisfaction.
Absolutely.
I'd never really considered that. Like, I always you always see these musicians in their, they don't like playing their own stuff. But yeah, I guess beyond a certain point, you just got to go with what the crowd loves, and that's where you get your
otherwise
good vibes from. It's like there's a reaction.
Well, they won't calm. They say, we've heard all that, but it's like pseudo echo.
Yeah,
in pseudo headquarters here.
Yeah.
On the night, Brian actually said, well, tonight we're going to be playing all our old stuff. And I thought, oh, isn't that funny? Because I don't think the crowd would have thought it'd be anything else, you know. But they obviously have a lot of new stuff. And he was talking in his interview about writing new stuff all the time, working on songs. And they obviously
They've got a clip that just, it looks like a Kraftwerk clip.
Oh.
Like they're sort of standing there behind keyboards, all of them, and sort of going through this sort of spacescape that's all, I guess, electronically generated. But it was, I was surprised. And that was, I think that was from 2010, or it was from certainly
quite recent.
This millennium that they put it out. But
well, I can imagine them being somewhere doing new music because they just look fantastic.
Yeah, right.
You know, it didn't have to be pseudo-echo music. They just looked so professional and wonderful. And the girl who was with them was excellent. And she looked fabulous. Yeah. And, so I wouldn't have even minded if they had played a couple of other songs because it would have been interesting to hear. But they knew what the crowd wanting, and they did go mad. As he said, they will all go mad at Funky Town.
Exactly. It was just like, it was almost like a coincidence that they even recorded it in the end.
Yeah, and wasn't that interesting what he said about the guy Lee Simon?
Yeah.
He was my favourite man at the time. Oh, God. He did Night Moves. He was the host of Night Moves.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
and
that was on Channel 10, wasn't it?
Yeah. When 10 was quite new. Yeah. And I didn't know at the time that he was a DJ on 3XY, which was the groovy station down there then before Triple M or whatever.
Because they had the same, I'm pretty sure 3XY had the same logo as 2SM, didn't they? With the zip.
Oh, I don't
denim?
know. They might have.
I think,
They would have been, the same kind of grooviness in their day. They would have been number one station.
Because all these things, like when you lived in Sydney and you were growing up, all these things were just things you only ever saw them mentioned on Hey Hey It's Saturday, or Countdown, or just like any of the other myriad of shows that came out of Melbourne at the time. It was like, I don't think we had in Melbourne, what was it, GTV or something?
Well, there was Go Set in the old days. That was fabulous.
That was Molly's.
Yeah,
that was Molly's.
That's when Molly was.
That was a magazine though, wasn't it?
It could have been. I'm thinking, what was the show? Oh dear, it kind of went hand in hand. It'll come to me. It's when Russell Morris did The Real Thing.
Yeah, because Molly produced that.
Yeah. Molly was, very groovy in his day. I'll have to hand him that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I can't think of that show. That's terrible because, that was a must watch. That was well before Countdown.
Yeah.
And you never missed it.
Oh, there's some great clips even on YouTube now of GTV.
Yeah, GTV.
And in Melbourne tonight, there's like some great Lobby Lloyd and the Coloured Balls clips.
Oh, yeah.
And just some of those other sort of,
Right, and they were on the telly.
Yeah.
I missed all that.
I saw. There was another band around called Carson.
Oh, yeah.
They were a blues band.
Yeah, I remember them.
Yeah.
Melbourne was very switched on.
Yeah.
After the Easy Beats, Sydney sort of fell into a bit of a hole.
Yeah.
And
Melbourne seems switched on to me right now.
Oh, it would be.
There's nothing really. It doesn't seem like there's much happening in Sydney.
No.
But I don't know. Melbourne's. As I was playing you those clips the other day, and it just seems like it's really starting to. Yeah. Well, I don't know if it's starting to or if it's been going for a while, and I've only just discovered it. But there's definitely a vibrant pub/punk rock scene happening down there that
amazing.
I really dig.
Yeah. Well, I think they cover every genre down there very well, And if you're from Sydney, you don't hear about it much because of that terrible Melbourne-Sydney hatred thing.
Yeah, but it was weird. Like when I lived in Melbourne, they would often make comparisons to Sydney. Oh, we can do it as good as Sydney. And it's like, look, I'm from Sydney and we don't even think twice about Melbourne. We never say, oh, this is better than Melbourne does.
No, that's right. It only works one way.
Yeah.
It's like when I went to New Zealand, they were like that,
Towards Australia.
Yes.
Yeah, but we don't.
And we're over here thinking, what are they talking about?
We're doing well.
It's very strange, very strange. But Sydney, certainly when in the 80s, I thought Sydney was, much more middle of the road.
Okay.
I know you had your big bands like In Excess and the Oils and stuff like that, but it still wasn't what Cold Chisel were doing,
Okay.
What they did, they
harder edge type thing.
Okay. And they never did get WEA never did get their sound the way they sounded live.
There was there was a pretty big scene of alternative bands. Like when I was sort of in high school from 82 through to 80, end of 87, like there was the street press, which was a paper called On the Street, and we,
Oh,
because
yeah.
we were too young to go to any of these things, but there was quite a few sort of bands on that sort of more, I guess, for want of a better term, alternative scene. There was like the Celibate Rifles and the Hard-Ons and the Proton Energy Pills that ended up becoming Tumbleweed. Like there was quite a lot going on, but it was really small scale.
Yeah.
Like, and occasionally there'd be breakouts, like the Rat Cat.
Oh,
remember
yes.
those guys from the sort of late 80s?
That was fantastic. You know? And Spy vs. Spy was...
Spy vs. Spy,
they did well.
The Rifles, the Hard-Ons, Mass Appeal, and the lead singer of that band, I think his name's Ben Brown, he ended up doing a lot of artwork for a lot of the bands and a lot of the venues. And it was kind of this kind of real horror comic type artwork. And now I think he lives at the Goldie and does artwork on surfboards.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, and then when I left school and I became